All right, so as you know from the award we just presented prior to the break, it's impossible to underestimate the impact that Minnesota Secretary of State Mark Ritchie and his staff have had on our work. Mark, in his presentation, is here today to contribute to our pursuit of a deeper understanding of absentee balloting. We asked Mark to give us a state-centric view of it, which I believe is absolutely essential. If progress is to be made, this is a vital position to understand. With that, I'm not going to go on longer. We're going to have lots of celebrations about Mark Ritchie going on from what I can tell. But we'd like to bring him up in person to talk to us about this crucial issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you to everyone for caring about this issue, but also for the work that you've done. The progress that was made, I think it is really fair to say this last election was a tipping point, and I want to underline that, but I also want to take an opportunity to talk about where we go from this tipping point. But Minnesota is interesting in a way because it is so much like other states in a lot of the origins of absentee voting and in some of the other changes in our voting. The Civil War plays a big role, and I'm going to come back to that. But I had the great privilege of having a UOCAVA staff who was there before I was elected, a reserve officer in the U.S. Army, a very distinguished military career. His father was also distinguished in the Bataan Death March, but his great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, Ephraim Pierce, was a Minuteman from New Hampshire and was at Bunker Hill. And in the minutes of the meeting of his town council, New England, highly organized, even in the pre-revolutionary times around town councils, there was an item at a special meeting that got called on December 12th, 1775. And the minutes record under the title, Soldiers Vote, a dispute arose representing some votes which were brought in writing of persons gone into the Army, including Ephraim Pierce, which being put to vote, they were allowed as if the men were present themselves. So not only is this a very old approach to representing the voice of citizens, especially those, in that case, out defending their colony, but it also is an indication that the word dispute has been closely associated with this process, be it military votes, overseas votes, absentee votes, whatever. And I think that is a theme that we hear, whether we're talking about absentee and military voting from the Revolutionary War period through the Civil War and really up through today. The Civil War definitely, and we heard that wonderful history this morning, was the place of the largest conversation. In my state of Minnesota, it was right on top of the statehood founding conversation, which has a lot of interesting voting history and struggles over voting rights as well, and I'll speak about that a little bit later. But in our state, there was a special session called of the legislature in August of 1862. It was called for a number of reasons centered around the war. Minnesota was the newest state in the Union. It had a belief that we needed to prove ourselves, so to speak. So when President Lincoln called for troops to defend the Constitution, Minnesota's governor happened to be here. He spoke up immediately and offered the first 1,000 troops, and those first 1,000 troops were mustered in almost immediately, thanks to the first stages of telegraph communication. So those were soldiers distinguished with the honor of being the first who responded to the president's call for troops to defend the Union. In 1862, at that special session, there was a lot of conversation because this was considered something of a partisan matter. It also was considered a matter of policy fairness, and there were practical questions. So those three things, the policy fairness questions, the partisan questions, and also the practical questions, have really been part of this question of absentee and particularly military and overseas voting, but all absentee voting essentially since the beginning. The partisan aspects led all the Democrats in the legislature and the Senate at that time to vote against the proposals to extend an absentee voting privilege and create a system for that. The thinking was that this was especially of interest to Abraham Lincoln. He was in a very difficult political spot. He himself believed he would not win that election. Some states were taking the conscious decision to not allow absentee voting. That would force soldiers who wanted to vote to leave the battlefield and come home. This was assumed to be helpful to the Democratic challenger as opposed to the Republican president. Pennsylvania comes to mind. I don't know all the detailed history of states, but in Minnesota, there was a desire on the part of some to help Lincoln. So there was a kind of partisan view in that way, and the Democrats opposed that. But there also was the policy question about, do we put into the hands of those carrying out an element of public policy the right to decide that policy through the polling place, through the voting booth? This is a topic I'll come back to because it's still with us today. Soldiers still say to me, I don't vote because I don't want to vote for my boss, meaning the commander-in-chief. But as a practical matter, our governor pointed out that in the northern states, I am a son of the Confederacy, so I have some mixed perspectives on some of this. But as a practical matter, 1/3 of the men, those who were eligible to vote, in the northern states were already in uniform, and it was possible that over half of the eligible voters in the northern states would come under the uniform. So the argument was like, would those out fighting just turn over the decision-making process to those who had stayed at home? And you could feel in the debate some bitterness, some questioning about that. So there was that question of fairness and just the policy of excluding so many, such a huge percent of our population, when we haven't had something comparable, but we have that element of the policy debate pretty often. And then the final thing was, well, how would you do it? Our legislature in that time, unlike some other states who said no to absentee voting, so soldiers had to basically go home if they wanted to vote, took the decision to create a system of 6 commissioners. I believe it was 3 from both of the 2 major parties at that time, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And those commissioners, 2 went east, 2 went to what we call the western battlefield, but the southern battles, where we had many Minnesota troops, and 2 were in the state. And they traveled and they basically did the voting process, and there was a secrecy component. But it was from that time that as a state we began developing our system. And of course, it has evolved and it has changed. But also it was in the context of other significant changes that came about in our whole voting system as a result of war and especially wartime service. Starting in the French-American War, French and Indian War before the Revolutionary War itself, particularly right after the Revolutionary War, working class citizens in some northern states had very vigorous protests against limitations on their right to vote that were through the sort of property ownership provisions. And so there was a move towards an expansion of the franchise as a result. First World War, Second World War, especially expansion of the franchise to people who had been previously disenfranchised. And certainly some of us here, but not all of us, are old enough to remember the struggle during the Vietnam War to lower the voting age to 18, and the debate was about, if you're old enough to be drafted, why aren't you old enough to vote? I was touched by that myself, getting out of high school, unable to vote, and was active in organizing at that time. My state of Minnesota actually was the first state to complete the ratification when the change came, and Honeywell Corporation donated a jet to take it to Washington to beat out some other state that was trying to also be first. So there is a competitive thing that goes on you can't get away from. But in any case, both the debate about voting of soldiers and others out in the field and the dramatic impact on the voting process itself and voting rights of military service and wars cannot be overstated in the state of Minnesota, but also, I think, in the whole country. This means that there are pressures that are worth examining in trying to understand how we might do better and how we might keep the process going. In fact, when I was elected, even in my campaigning, there were people who pointed out some of the difficulties of voting. You've heard, all of you have seen some of that. But what I didn't know, I didn't imagine, was that on my desk the morning I was sworn in, and I hadn't been in my office before then, so on my desk was a letter from Department of Defense, from what we now call Federal Voting Assistance Project, addressed to my predecessor, who was also on the ballot, and basically saying, you know, every year we write you this same letter. That was interesting. Minnesota does a great job. We're always #1 in voting turnout year after year. But on absentee, particularly military voting, you suck. And they would lay it out there. And then they said, and here's 10 suggestions, really specific with almost legislative language. You know, things that we think of as very common sense, things that were kind of revolutionary at the time. But we were a little amazed that this had been coming every year to our state. We were typically expecting people to be responsive when there's somebody pointing out an improvement that could happen. But anyhow, we turned this over to the Legislative Council. It got translated into a bill. The bill got introduced. Quite a bit of it actually came through legislation. There were some things. The governor was especially opposed to the provisions around emergency powers. Executives are pretty territorial when it comes to emergency powers, and maybe Sandy might break the back of that. But anyhow, another one was what was referred to as citizen aliens, and we call them military brats. But anyhow, Minnesota is a state with many military people overseas, but many missionaries overseas, many people in the diplomatic corps, many people who are from the old country and go back to the old country for a variety of reasons. And we have quite a few young people who are Minnesotan in all ways, including their football allegiance and their slang, but they've not lived in our state. And you may know this, but our state is one of the, I think, about 25 or so states who deny the right to vote to those children of Minnesotans who do have the right to vote, something that the governor refused. In any case, it was a great piece of legislation. It made a lot of changes in the delivery system and so on and so forth. But it, like many pieces of good legislation, it takes a while to ripen, and it was, I believe, vetoed the first time around. So we had to wait until the MOVE Act kind of helped move a bunch of stuff. But we were able to make some of those changes early on with great effect, especially the delivery through electronic means of the ballot. We eventually did get the most important thing, of course, was the 45, or in our case, 46 days, 46-day change. And this was a very dramatic change. And for our state, I mentioned earlier, we're now above 99% success rate. Our military and overseas voters are typically slightly higher. It's not significant, but slightly higher than our domestic. You know, we would love to get to 100% acceptance, and you know, that's something that we will continue to work on. We also were able to look more deeply into the whole system thanks to 3 statewide recounts. In Minnesota, there was a big one in the 1930s, a statewide recount. I don't know much about that one. There was a big one in 1962 that really set the pattern for how recounts are done at a large scale in our state. And then I've had 3. Seems a little more than my share. But I learned a lot of things about absentee voting and also about the origins of some of our laws. Many different laws have come about in the course of recounts and absentee balloting procedures. I won't go into them all, but one of the things that we ended up seeing was that because there were way too many little requirements of dating the signature and that didn't have a lot of meaning, but they were fatal if they were not corrected, that we needed more time so that people could correct ballots that weren't properly completed. They would be notified. They could come make a change or get a second one in the mail. But second, that I think in the case of one of the big recounts, there were about 10,000 that had errors that could not be overlooked. The courts are making these decisions, not me. But it was interesting, those 10,000, one of the candidates insisted that 4,000 of them named should be open, and the other candidate insisted that the other 6,000 named should be open. And, you know, I guess I should not have been too shocked by this, but as a practical matter, because campaigns are so intensive on micro-targeting, they've turned out people. They know your name, so maybe they know who you've contributed money to over time, or if you own a Volvo or whatever. Minnesota, a lot of people own Volvos. What your age might be, what your zip code is, and so there's basic information that does put a stretch and a strain on the overall system. But as a practical matter, we took some steps to make some changes. Some of you may find this shocking, but Minnesota used to process our absentee ballots in each of the 4,000 polling places at night after the close of the polling place on Election Day, in case a scandal or a plane crash might have changed the makeup of the final candidacies and people's opinions of those candidates up till the last moment, so that individuals could come in on Election Day, vote, and then that would be used to eliminate that absentee ballot so a second ballot could not be cast. But you can see the logic, perhaps, of that, and it was a strong psychological matter in Minnesota where we had scandals and plane crashes that had dramatically changed dynamics. But the nightmare of that for election judges and for election officials was exposed and got momentum, and that momentum was used to change the system to a centralized, county-based, professionally based absentee ballot board. And the following summer at the State Fair, I got a lot of ice cream cones brought to me by election judges whose husbands were also glad that they had come home at some hour of the night that wasn't 5 or 6 in the morning, and other things that made it clear that this was a change long overdue. But these decisions, these rules that we have origins, they have history, they have stories. Changing them is difficult. Elected officials believe they got elected under the current system, no problem, or very suspicious of proposed changes. Many changes proposed, people immediately think, unfortunately, that's good for my party, I want that. Or they think that's bad for my party, I don't want that. This is a dramatic story that occurs a lot of the time, but it can be overcome. Even in Minnesota, we go back to the origins of our state with a story because we were sort of encouraged to apply to be a state because of the knowing that we would come in as a free state, non-slave state, and they were balancing that. Democrats and Republicans got elected to send people to the convention to write the Constitution to submit to the Congress. That's the procedure. They showed up in our state capitol and got into a huge rumble. And the talk is that they drew knives and pistols and there were fistfights, and whatever it was, they split into 2 conventions and wrote 2 different constitutions. And good old Minnesota, there's verbatim transcripts of both. One of them, thank the University of Michigan, is out in a very cheap version. Amazing reading if you're really a geek. The other one's a little more expensive, not yet reproduced. But as a practical matter, there were many things similar. There were some very big differences. The difference that almost sank the whole venture came out as they were forced by Congress to say they must submit only one constitution. In that process, the item that caused the greatest grief and almost broke the talks was the Democratic demand that the existing right at that time of African American men to vote should be withdrawn, and the Republican demand that that right of African American men to vote, which was the cultural habit and the standard practice, should be sustained. The belief was Republicans were the party of Lincoln. There would be their votes. Democrats, just like their own opposition to absentee voting, they thought those soldiers would be Lincoln voters. So that partisan decision was right there in front. There were lots of other debates. You know, we in our Constitution, both parties granted the right or wanted to grant the right to vote to people who were immigrants, who weren't yet citizens, but who said, I wanted to become a citizen. We repealed that 50 years later or so. But as a practical matter, this question became core. And in the end, there was a compromise. The Republicans gave up, accepted the Democratic demand to take away the right to vote of African American men, but they got as a concession an extremely low, unbelievably low threshold for amending the Constitution. And then they spent the next 10 years in 3 successive attempts and finally reversed that decision and reestablished the right to vote to freed African American men. So even at the founding of the state, the partisan elements of these debates and discussions were always there. One of the interesting outcomes of that is that in this last year, we had a big debate on our ballot, on our constitutional amendment that gets placed on the ballot. Because there's this low threshold that exists today, amendment was put on our ballot to essentially eliminate Election Day registration as we know it, which is important because that's why we're always the #1 state, and that's why Wisconsin is always right there by Minnesota as the #2 state or in the same range. Second, to dramatically change absentee voting, essentially to require wherever you were a voter, it said all voters, including those not voting in person, having to show proof of identity and proof of residence wherever they were on the planet. Not exactly sure how that would happen, and then other requirements as well. So that went on the ballot, although it was a very partisan vote in the legislature. The rule is just simply a simple majority. And we had a very sharp debate about this. And the questions about the impact on military voters, on absentee voters, on all male voters. Minnesota has not really opened up its system much. We don't have no excuse absentee. We don't have early voting, but we have people who walk into their clerk's office and they vote absentee in person, and they, mark one of the reasons. But we did have an opening on mail balloting a few years ago. We have 4,000 precincts. 2,000 are essentially, or roughly 2,000 are townships in the countryside. 532 of them have chosen the vote by mail option, and they like it. It is much cheaper. Don't let anyone say it's not cheaper. They also are side by side townships of the same size, same people, same ethnicity who have walk-in voting. And it's a dramatic change impact on voting, especially in special elections, off-year elections, primary elections. We can decide we don't care about low voting in those elections, but we should be cautious in saying that. I'm a little sensitive because people think of down ballot races, that's what they call secretaries of states, don't really matter. So maybe I'm a little personally sensitive. But the notion that we don't acknowledge the dramatic impact of mail balloting on those elections who determine our candidates, those elections who deal with emotional situations like special elections, those elections that aren't every 4 years in a presidential, but who pick our governors. This is something that needs, I think, just more consideration. All mail balloting in our townships can be laid against townships right next door, and you can see the dramatic difference. So we have these things. They would have been affected dramatically. People made a decision to affirm our decision. This was really great. And every once in a while, of course, in those debates, you get a lot of emotional things. You get love letters and death threats, brickbats and side comments. But every once in a while, you get something that says, oh, that's why we partner with OVF to do this kind of thing. That's why we make a difference. And this was just a letter from an older Air Force guy who wrote to one of our local election officials, Mrs. Anderson, so this is to Sharon Anderson, a county election official in a county pretty far up north where they have some great walleye fishing if you're interested in that. My absentee ballot was delivered last Thursday, 25th October. I've never thought of tracking my vote before, but not to let technology scare me, I checked out my results. I was thrilled to read the words, "Your ballot was accepted. Your vote will be counted." No matter who you are, where you are, politically or physically around the globe, those words make freedom ring. It is honestly the coolest thing I've seen since my last rocket launch at Cape Canaveral. Thank you. John Buck Buchanan, Major, U.S. Air Force. Thank you very much. Keep it moving. There's food.
Yeah. We need to invite the Roundtable participants to come up. Hopefully they're back here. So take a question or two, Mark. Sorry.
I'll take a question or two while we're getting. Yes.
Yeah, and your all mail-in districts, is that for all the elections, federal and state, or just their local elections?
All. In those districts. I think it's 532. It actually was a little controversial because townships are afraid that they will be wiped out, that they'll be, eliminated. And so having their physical elections in March has been an important sort of stake in the ground. So there was some nervousness, but now that there's that many. But we still have our township elections that are separate, where people come, but they're annual meetings, so they're in March. And actually, that's the one time we've made a decision. If there's a big snowstorm, they get to postpone a week. Otherwise, we're not prepared. Yes. Go ahead.
What is the difference in the participation rate between these neighboring townships where one does all mail-in and the other is voting in person?
I think I would suggest you send an email, go on the OVF list of local election officials, send an email to Blue Earth County. Nice name, Blue Earth County. Mankato, the election official there probably has one of the most interesting sort of sets of townships that decided and townships that decided against right next to each other, and she has this in her head. But, for example, you can have 10% and 60%. I mean, that's an extreme. But you can send her, town taxpayer services official Patty O'Connor, Blue Earth County, Minnesota, and she can give you, very specific results of that, and then she could reference you to our statewide results. So it's dramatic in many, many, many elections. But you can imagine that for the election judges who are sitting there all day long with almost nobody coming in, there's also a diminishing of energy aspect that's different to saving a bunch of money and increasing your turnout and increasing public participation. There are psychological benefits as well. So thank you again. Thank you very much.
Okay, our panelists are going to sit down, or our roundtable participants, no panels. I'm going to start by just introducing Judith Murray very quickly. We first started working with Judy in 2009 when she was working on her study of Americans abroad. And since finishing her PhD and teaching in Newcastle, she joined the OVF research team, and she's been an associate researcher behind the EASE grants, because we do a lot of reporting there, and the post-election research. We were really fortunate to get Judy here, not just because of the freak blizzard in the UK. She spent 3 days trying to get here, but also because really she's going to bring this roundtable to life. For those of you who don't think we listen, we really listen. For years, or actually last year, I guess several election officials surrounded my colleague Jane here, who works on the election official directory, keeping it up to date, and basically threatened her if they didn't put a local on the panel or on some roundtable. So we got cracking, and we've actually done it. I'm going to let Judy take over with introduction of her participants and a nice spirited discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, just quickly, I want to introduce the panel, but I also want to just add that if you could spend some time and look at their bios, this is an extremely diverse panel that reflects the diversity of election jurisdictions in the United States, different practices. So it's well worth looking at the additional information that's been provided in your program guide about the panel. So to the very end here, we have Steve Trout, who's the Oregon State Elections Director. Sitting next to Steve is Julie Flynn, Deputy Secretary of State of the great state of Maine. Next to Julie is Gary Smith, Program Evaluation Manager, Election Consultant. This election cycle, Fulton County, Georgia, which includes the city of Atlanta. Sitting next to Gary is David Stafford, Supervisor of Elections, Escambia County, Florida, which includes Pensacola. And next to David is Maggie Toulouse Oliver, County Clerk, Bernalillo County, New Mexico, which includes the city of Albuquerque. And what we're going to do, I've had an opportunity to speak with the panel members prior to this while it was snowing in the UK. And it appeared that there were a lot of issues on the domestic front. And we're going to start there, and we'll end with Uocava issues. So basically, what I'd like to do is to ask each of you how your absentee balloting went this year. And I also want to point out, because a lot of you raised with me, the relationship between absentee balloting processes, provisional balloting, and early voting. Okay, so you're kind of the odd man out, though, at the end in terms of Oregon. So why don't you just give a quick synopsis of how things work in Oregon for us?
Be happy to, and it's not the first time I've been called the odd man out. Elections in Oregon are all by mail. So I wake up at and so at 7:30 in the morning on election day, I'm having breakfast with my family. I'm not worried about how many polling places are opened, if the ballots got there, any accessibility issues, if it's snowing, if it's raining, and it will be raining. But it's really a much simpler process to administer because we're only administering one election. It's all by mail, so we don't have polling places and vote by mail. It's all vote by mail, so we don't have issues of early voting because we're voting starting 18 days before the election. We mail the ballots out, and voters have that 2.5-week period to return them to us. And so, it gives people enough time to be informed. We provide a lot of information to them to be able to vote, and we've been getting really high turnout rates, certainly in a presidential election, but I think where we really see the advantages of vote by mail is in elections that don't have a high profile issue at the top of the ticket. And because we're mailing a ballot to every registered voter, we're able to get a much higher return rate than we would if people had to take some action to reach out to be able to cast a ballot. So voting in Oregon is very, very smooth. People have been doing it now for over a decade, and so we've worked through a lot of the kinks there. And I think for this election, we had there was only 0.7% of ballots that were returned that were not counted for any reason, and about a third of those were simply because the person didn't sign them, even after we gave them 10 extra days after the election to come in and sign them. So we were talking back in the back room. It's like, those are the people you want to strangle, but we give them the best opportunity we can to vote, and then it's up to them to take the action to cast the ballot.
Okay, thanks. And Julie, how about in Maine then?
I think what's different in Maine from the rest of the panel is that we vote on a municipal level. We have no county-based election administration in Maine. Our smallest jurisdiction is 5 voters. Our largest is 50,000 voters. So we're a very rural state over a very large geographic area. It makes it easier for the voter to get in touch with their local election official. And so that's easier for the voter. The local election official issues the ballots, and the ballots are returned to them. We have had no reason absentee voting since 2000, November 2000 election, and our voting increased from about 11% of absentee ballots cast in 2000 to almost 32% in 2008. It was a little lower this year. It was about 27%, and I think that's more to the major campaigns didn't do an absentee ballot drive as they've done in the past.
And what did you attribute that to, Julie?
I think it's more the campaigns not really sending absentee ballots to people. They did send the link to our online ballot request service, but I think many people chose to just vote at the polls. Our overall turnout was a little lower as well from 2008. And I think one of the things that helped to make absentee ballot, at least processing the ballots, a little better for the local election officials this time is that in 2011, the legislature implemented a cutoff for requesting your absentee ballot unless you have a special reason. So there is no reason voting up until the third business day before or the Thursday before the election. And after that, you have to have a reason. So it does give the clerks Friday and Monday to get their ballots ready for processing and to get their lists ready and make sure they have accounted for all their absentee voters before producing the election day list.
Yeah, because we talked earlier about the issue of list maintenance and the impact that has on even increasing situations with provisional ballots and stuff. So hopefully we'll go back to that. Gary, what can you tell us about Georgia?
Well, first of all, what I'd like to do is kind of give you a little bit of background on Georgia from that standpoint. Georgia's a no-excuse absentee voting. In the past, we have had as long as 45 days prior to the election where we could vote in various locations throughout the counties. We are today down to 21 days, the same thing. We can have multiple sites, locations, etc. They have to be, the early voting sites have to be in government buildings for a security standpoint and that type of thing. What I'd also like to do, from the standpoint of some data and that sort of thing, I'd like to take you back to 2008 when I was the director of elections for one of the counties, which is just north of Atlanta. And this happened because the data I presented was at a Pew Foundation meeting for, we were looking at improving elections through the use of data. And I'm a little bit of a data geek anyway, so maybe you'll have to put up with me for this. What I wanted to do is show you here, if you're able to see it, in the upper left-hand quadrant, what we're doing is we're looking at, it is hard to see, but the darkest spots in that are the highest turnouts by precinct for the particular county that I'm in. If you go down one below that, what you're looking at is you're looking at the turnout on election day. So they're almost the reverse of each other in this type of a thing. The total turnout is in the upper right-hand quadrant, and what we're looking at there is just how did it turn out by precinct across the whole thing. A lot of it's got to do, and I kind of refer back to what John said this morning, John Fortier, is that what we're doing in early voting is we're really being very careful about how do we pick our locations where we have our early voting sites, and what kind of an impact does that have on turnout. I say in this one here, I was just fortunate. I think I picked some pretty good locations because when we looked at the total turnout for the election, is we were running about 80% with a variability of no more than 2% in the precinct. So, that says that things worked well. And we have a diverse county of commuters who go into Atlanta and others. Following that, what I wanted to show you here is something a little bit different. I was asked to review the election, in fact, stepped in to help the election in Fulton County, which is a large county with over 600,000 registered voters. And we had a little bit of a discrepancy in really some of the things that happened. And what happened is pretty evident in the information that's on these graphs and how it impacted the turnout. And if you could see it, the lower part of the county, we have the demographics in the county are fairly stark a little bit, both economically and racially. The lower part of the county, you can see a very large red conglomeration, which is several precincts, where we had very, very high turnouts in early voting. Early voting turnouts over 60–70% for those precincts. The county only had 6 individual locations across a county of that size. I mean, you're going all the way from the north to the south. You're talking about distances of almost 60 miles north to south. And what I was really concerned about was really how did that impact the turnout? Well, after looking at the data and pulling it together, it was pretty significant. The graph on the right is the accumulated turnout on a percent basis for the individual precincts. And you can see that where there was high turnout, very high turnout in the early voting, it showed a subsequent fairly significant turnout also for the election day. So one of the things that we tried to do then is we tried to figure out, why and everything else. And the locations, one of the things I found out in the locations is that they had been picked not very well, to tell you the truth. And what I was concerned about in the report that I wrote on the election had a lot to do with how do you pick locations and how do you make sure they're right and impact everything in the correct way. The other thing that happened in Fulton County is that we had an extremely high turnout of people, but we also had a large number of provisional ballots that were cast. In the state, we've also, and what I've tried to do here too, is to show demographically how the provisional ballots were, attuned by precinct, and if the early voting sites had anything to do with it and other things. What I came down to is we had a 300% increase in provisional ballots over 2008. We had over 10,000 provisional ballots that were issued. We had 52% of them were cast, so 5,000 some were done. The problem that I see and the concern I have with that is most people who are not election officials and don't do the grunt work like we do, at the lower level, don't understand the work that has to go on from the day of election on how you handle a provisional ballot. We're spending, a lot of nodding here, and I can see that. And frankly, it's an awful lot of work because we have to give somebody 72 hours in which to turn in identification. We're up against a deadline which has to be done on Saturday to certify our election. So we are working continuously with staffs of people. And in this case, with a 300% increase over the prior general election, we were overwhelmed.
Why do you think there was such an increase, though? And what would you propose to do about it?
I think there's some really good ones on it. First of all, we had redistricting. Okay, that was a big issue, and of course a lot of people didn't know where they were. Secondly, what's been happening is that in the early voting process, people are forgetting really where they vote. So when it used to be you only voted in your precinct, it wasn't an issue. Now what's happening is people are going to early voting sites which are spread throughout the county, and frankly they've forgotten where they are. I think the third point is that we have a lot of people who only vote in presidential elections. They don't really remember where they vote. And the fourth thing is that in our state, or at least in Fulton County, there was a lot of pressure by the political parties to tell people that, well, they could just vote anywhere. So what happened is we ended up with a lot of people coming in to vote out of precinct, and we had to issue them provisional ballots. And what happens with that is that I was listening to Ritchie speak about the down ballot part. Well, if you were a down ballot person and you were voting for somebody in the wrong precinct, when we go to duplicate the ballot, you aren't going to vote because you're going to lose out on that. So that's something. Finally, I think I put in something here. Again, we had 10 times as many provisional ballots cast and Fulton County as our nearest counties, which were of significant size too. So that was a big issue. And then you asked me what the top reasons were. Well, I put them up there. And it was interesting is that the locations closest to the universities, we have some fairly significant universities in Fulton County, is where we had some of the largest number of provisional ballots. That's kind of my story.
David, you also told me about the problem that you had with early voting sites, or the inflexibility, I think. Can you comment on that and
Sure.
how you might resolve that?
Sure. First, a little background on the state of Florida. You may have heard of the state of Florida elections. We're actually pretty proud of our work there. We actually had we're about 12.5 million voters. We had about 8.5 million that voted in this election. Interestingly, I was looking at our numbers here locally in our county, and just in the 12 years since 2000. In 2000, 82% of the votes that were cast on Election Day. In 2012, 45% of the votes that were cast on Election Day. And that's a fundamental shift. From an election administration standpoint, we embrace that. We think that's a good thing. There are 3 distinct ways to cast a ballot in our state. We too, like Georgia, are a no-fault or no-excuse absentee state and have been for many years. The evolution of early voting started as what they called in-person absentee voting, and I'll talk about that in a second because that actually reemerged as a pretty big issue in Florida in this election cycle. And then it became standardized really in 2004 was the first election, and then it sort of branched out in 2006 and has really gone full gang, full bore ahead since then. Those of you who follow elections closely, which most of you in this room do, know that there was some pretty controversial changes made to the election laws of the state of Florida back in 2011. And this was the first statewide election that we had to implement those. And so a lot of attention was put on that. But we had 75% turnout in our county. Overall, the turnout in the state was a little over 70%. We had, again, 26% of our votes cast were absentee, 29% were early, and 45% election day. Pretty similar numbers to what we saw in 2008. They're actually a little bit higher level of turnout on election day as a share of the votes as opposed to where it was 4 years ago. But overall, very good turnout. We had an 88% return rate on our absentee ballots, and it was about the same for UOCAVA and domestic ballots. And that overall, we had about 39,500 absentee ballots cast in our county. Of those, about 8,000 are UOCAVA. Those of you who may be familiar with our area, Pensacola Naval Air Station, home of the Blue Angels. We also have the Navy Cryptology School, now called the Center for Information Dominance. Big military presence, and so we have a lot of UOCAVA voters. And we also were awarded, there was a consortium, the state, interestingly, the state chose not to apply for the EASE grant. And so my colleague, Paul Lux, who has succeeded Pat Holloran, who's here in the audience from Okaloosa County, we got together and said, okay, if the state's not going to do it, we're going to do it on our own. And so we formed a consortium of 13 counties, applied for and were awarded an FAP EASE grant. And we partnered with Democracy Live for a system of online ballot delivery that, again, embraced technology. We found that to be a useful tool that our voters embraced. But as far as the early voting, this is nothing new. We have for years, we as supervisors on the front lines, when they put into the law where sort of tried to standardize when they shifted from in-person absentee to early voting as it's known now. They said, okay, where are we going to do this? And so they said elections offices, municipality or city halls, and public libraries. Well, for some jurisdictions, for some counties, and we're a county-based election system in the state of Florida, that works great. We have some counties that have 20 municipalities. We happen to have 2. Some counties have a robust public library system. We, up until last year or so have not. And so it severely limits where you can do early voting. So then you have to try to take maximum advantage of the situation that you have. But we again, overall, I think that we've done a very good job, I spent last week, the first part of last week, over in Tallahassee visiting with our legislators, both in the House and the Senate, giving them some suggestions on ways to improve the system. And I think we're actually going to make some progress. I think we're going to get some flexibility on early voting locations. I think that, and that's really the biggest one. And also length of the ballot. We had a kind of a localized issue specific to Florida where we had an extraordinarily lengthy ballot. And those of you who are in election administration know that when you go from one card, if you will, one piece of paper to two pieces of paper, that just increases the level of complexity, dramatically. In a lot of counties, ours for one, was the first time we had to deal with that. So overall, we feel pretty good about the election, but there's always room for improvement.
Maggie, you have an interesting situation, I think, in your jurisdiction with voting centers, and I'm wondering how that impacts early voting.
It's a good question. We implemented a vote center election in the primary and general election in Bernalillo County for the first time in 2012. And let me back up a little. Bernalillo County is the Albuquerque metropolitan area. For those of you who are familiar with New Mexico, we are a huge state, and the vast majority of our population is concentrated in the Albuquerque metro area. We have 430,000 registered voters in Bernalillo County, which is a third of the state's population. We have 33 total counties, and my smallest size county of Bernalillo has a third of the voters. So that's the jurisdiction that I manage. I'm an elected county clerk there, and when I came in 2007, we had suffered, a rash of election problems in New Mexico. We were the other recount state in 2000. We had 366 votes went to Gore at the end of the day, and in 2006, right before I took office, we had an extremely close congressional election between then Congresswoman Heather Wilson and our then Attorney General Patricia Madrid, which ended up being about an 800 vote difference out of, a couple 100,000 cast. So we have had the national spotlight on New Mexico and in Bernalillo County in the past, and so I sort of came in with a mandate to get that spotlight off of us for negative reasons, and we've largely been successful, and a lot of what we have done to make that happen, and I will get back to vote centers, but is in absentee balloting. We were those folks in Bernalillo County before I became clerk that were there until the wee hours of the morning, and then in days past Election Day counting absentee ballots. One of the first things that I worked on when I came into office was to begin the process of counting absentee ballots starting 5 days, as many as 5 days before Election Day. That has helped improve our process tremendously, getting that lead time to do the ballot processing. In 2008, we had 90,000 absentee ballots in Bernalillo County. We were a swing state. We were a swing county. Both campaigns were heavily pushing absentee voting, and I was going, no, please push them to early. I'm in the Jack 48 camp. I think an in-person ballot really reduces a lot of the problems, but I do see a very important need for absentee balloting. In New Mexico, we are also a no-fault absentee or no-excuse absentee state. Fast forward to 2012, we had a very different looking election. New Mexico was no longer a swing state. We fell off the map. We didn't get those election resources that we had in the 2008 election. And so to the extent that the campaigns were pushing people to vote, they were pushing them toward early voting. I think a lot of the reason for that is, especially in Bernalillo County, we have really upped the ante as far as early voting is concerned. We have statutory minimums in New Mexico in terms of how many early voting locations you can have and some bare minimums for what you need to be able to do at those. We basically always go over and above, and one of the reasons we're able to do that is because my county is the wealthiest county, and we do have some of our own resources that we can bring to the table to do that, but we also have the most voters. So we really need to do that. At least that's my personal philosophy. So we really had we actually had record early voting turnout in the 2012 election. We had about 25,000 more voters come and vote early than did so in 2008, comparing apples to apples. But our absentee voting dropped down to less than half, somewhere between a third and a half of what we experienced in the 2008 election. I think part of that had to do with the lack of being a swing state and not having those resources being invested into turnout. Our overall turnout was slightly lower. We went from around 70% to about 63%, and that was the absentee balloting that was missed. We had record turnout in early. We had about the same turnout on Election Day voting, and we did have vote centers on Election Day. And I think, and I have yet to confirm this, but we might be the largest jurisdiction to have done vote center voting in a general election so far. We actually were very successful with the implementation, and I think a lot of the reason for that is because, I mean, besides the fact that, you know, we planned and did a lot of logistics and did all that good stuff that you want your elections officials to do, but 70% of our votes were cast before Election Day, and the vast majority of that was done so through early voting. So that's sort of a little summary of what we did in New Mexico and how vote centers impacted. And really, you know, I do think the swing state factor and what we did in early voting, and I know that sort of became a theme up here, but what you do in early voting really impacts your absentee balloting.
But I want to go back to this issue of the locations of early voting sites, because that seems to have really been an issue, in particular for you, Gary. I mean, how does that get resolved? How would you propose that gets resolved?
Well, one of the recommendations I've made in a report that I wrote to the county is that they needed to, first of all, you know, do some sort of a study to see how many facilities were out there that they could tap into. And one of the issues that we have in the state of Georgia is that you have to, on Election Day, or even for early voting for that matter, is it has to be held in a government-owned facility. Not on Election Day, but in early voting. So what we've done is we've gone back to our attorneys and we've said, you know, is there some way we can get around this issue of making it a municipal or a, you know, government operation? And we've said we could lease spaces. And one of the recommendations that I made to them, I said, we need to follow kind of the rule like where the shopping centers go. And we need to move our locations out of the libraries, which really don't have the facilities. They have small rooms. They don't have the communication capabilities, and they don't have the parking. One of the locations in the northern part of the county that we had, and I was working at just to see what it was like, is we had 500 people standing in line for voting. It was taking us up to 3 to 3.5 hours to move people through this. And it was because we had a restriction on the number of input stations that we could put into the location. So, I mean, we had a physical location. We didn't have a technical one. So the recommendation I was making is I said, let's go where the people go. Let's go where they can park. I mean, there's all kinds of shopping centers throughout Fulton County that have got facilities that close down, don't have spaces. And for 21 days or for a month, we could lease these spaces easily. And I agree, because I'm a very big proponent of early voting, because it eases the issue on Election Day significantly, because we have so many other things that we're doing. Whether it's dealing with the provisional ballots we've got to work over, you know, it's all the other data, and the back office operations, which few people really don't know enough about. If you're in the academic world, you look at our results, but if you're in our world, you look at the things that happen in the back office that nobody ever gets a chance to see. And that's the tough part. So I would, you know, that is part of my recommendation to the county. We will increase the numbers. And to give you an idea of the kind of scope, the county that I had retired from had 100,000 registered voters. We had 6 early voting sites. We voted 60% of the people prior to the general election. Okay? Here in Fulton County, we had 6 early voting sites, not properly chosen, and for 600,000 registered voters. I mean, there's a little bit of a dichotomy there.
And I think what's a really interesting contrast, Julie, when I talked to you, I thought, wow, this is fantastic. In Maine, for Election Day voting, I know it's a slightly different scenario, but there's a statute that has a specific allocation for voting equipment per population.
Well, it's actually voting booths. We use all paper ballots that are tabulated, optical scan tabulated or hand counted. So about half our jurisdictions will tabulate their ballots. But we do have to have 1 voting booth per 200 voters. So that helps that. And the other thing we did a couple of years ago was to move back the opening time. We used to be, if your population was under 4,000, you can open as late as 10 a.m. And there's a lot of people who commute a distance to work. So now all but under 500 now can have to open by 8 a.m. So that has helped a lot.
I just want to ask, because I want to bring Steve into this and just go back a little bit to absentee, like what I would constitute a proper absentee ballot or your all voting election. Are you concerned about how you might handle things if there's continued discussion about modification in the Postal Service? Because several of you, when I talked with you individually, said this could be an issue with absentee ballots in the future.
Yeah, obviously changes. I mean, we're managers of change, so there's going to be change, and there's going to be changes in the Postal Service. And although I don't have early voting sites, I think changes in the Postal Service are my equivalent there. And so in Oregon right now we have 5 mail processing centers, and under the proposed cuts we will go down to 1. And so I'm not as concerned about an extra day, delivery here or there, but what I'm growing more concerned with, well, first off, we're working with the post office to change some processes as far as mail entry, so that if I'm out in eastern Oregon, 500 miles away from the remaining sorting facility in Portland, that we can just have the ballots approved to just go outbound in the mail there. They wouldn't have to be put in the mailbox, travel 500 miles to Portland, travel 500 miles back, and then be delivered. So we're working on changing our processes there in anticipation of these changes, and have been for a couple of years now. We've got a really good relationship with the post office that helps there. My concern is, as we get farther and further away from this single sorting facility, if I'm out in rural Oregon and it takes me 3 days for my ballot to get delivered to the county elections office where it's counted, but it only takes 1 day if I live in Portland, am I treating my voters equally? And so that's a big concern that I'm trying to look at how we balance. And I think the same thing applies to early voting centers. And the same thing applies to reaching out to voters with accessibility needs. The more services we try to provide, and especially with elections administered at different levels of government, the more traps there are there. So for instance, I've got 36 counties. A couple of my counties are absolutely fantastic at reaching out to assisted living centers, going to places where there are people with disabilities to help them use the tools we've created. But then other counties aren't as active. They don't have the resources, they don't have the budget, and so they're not as strong in that area. And so, at the end of the day, am I treating this group of voters more favorably than the other? And is that the next round of lawsuits that's coming? And so I'm just trying to anticipate that, and it gets back to more uniformity, and we'll hear that somebody on one side of the street in one county has these rules that they're operating under, and then somebody on the other side of the street in the other county has these rules. I think that it's getting harder and harder to justify different rules for those types of people, unfortunately. For example, if we're in Oregon and everything's vote by mail, and I have one county that mails ballots to everybody 20 days before the election, and then I have another one that only mails about 7 days before the election, I can't justify that. I can't support that. So at the state level, we're trying to, through statutes and procedures to standardize things and make them more uniform, so that we have that consistency, and that we're trying to treat all voters in the state with the same opportunities. We may not have the same results, but we want to make sure that they have the same opportunities. So Postal Service and their issues is obviously a portion of that, but who knows where we're going to be in 5 years, and right now, my backup plan, I mean, we have the ability for people to download their ballot wherever they are on the planet. We were able to use that to our advantage here at the last election, when we had some of our residents stuck here on the East Coast with the superstorm that couldn't get back. We were able to have them go online, download their ballot, mark it, and FedEx or UPS it back overnight to get it to us, so that we were able to count it. And so there's more and more uses of technology that are out there. I think as we learn more with our UOCAVA voters and are able to gain more confidence in those processes and procedures, that things have changed so rapidly here in the last 10 years relative to the previous 50. I don't anticipate that rate is going to slow. And so at least I know I am, and I'm sure my colleagues are, always looking at the changes that are coming and how we try to stay a little bit ahead of that and anticipate, so that we don't get cornered in or are able to take advantage of new tools and new opportunities. Because that's one of the great things with vote by mail is my election is an 18-day process. So if there's a storm or an earthquake or a fire, even if that's over a week, it doesn't kill my election. We've still got other means to be able to attack that.
Now you've talked about the uniformity, and that's a nice kind of segue to go into UOCAVA and full implementation of the MOVE Act, electronic transmission of election material. David, I'll ask you first, because you've got a huge military population in your jurisdiction. How did that work?
Well, the good thing about Florida is that we actually, I would argue, a lot of the MOVE Act was modeled on things we were already doing in the state of Florida. And so we didn't have to do a lot of, as far as the legislative changes to comply with the MOVE Act, there were very few that had to occur in Florida. It's gone well. I'm a big proponent of embracing technology, and again, MOVE and all of the reforms have really focused on the delivery of the materials to the voters. We still, there's still the issue of the materials getting back to us in a timely fashion. I think that there's been great progress made. I saw Bob Carey out there in the audience, and during his tenure at FVAP, I know he worked very hard on that, and I think we've seen, particularly with some of the mail service on the military side, expediting that coming back. We saw some real progress in that. In Florida, if you're overseas, we heard some kind of chuckles, I think, on a previous presenter about faxing. But that still is a method that is utilized by overseas voters when they, for time reasons or whatever. And then there's the next logical step that our Secretary of State, then Secretary of State Kurt Browning, who was a former local election official when he was Secretary, went and did a trip overseas with some other election officials from across the country. And the one thing he came back hearing was, fax, really? Does anybody still have a fax machine? What we heard earlier today. And so the next logical step is, okay, if you can do that, then why can't you email a PDF back of your ballot? And then that you cross a line there where it opens up to a whole new set of critiques and criticisms and concerns. And so that step, at least in Florida, has not yet been crossed, but overall, I guess it's a long-winded way of saying it's been good. We also, have been operating under a consent decree with the federal government since the early '80s. As far as the return of materials, we allow 10 days past election day for overseas ballots to come back in. Yeah.
And Julie, you in Maine, they did something interesting with the UOCAVA voter database. Basically, that also facilitated streamlining things? Well,
we centralized the process. Instead of having the 500 municipalities issue the ballots to their voters, they're done by the elections division. So it was a good thing for the voters. It created a one-stop shop where they could get their ballot. I just was looking, we issued 68% of our ballots were issued electronically, and we actually had 64% of them were returned electronically. So we had a huge improvement, although we did about 2.5 times as many ballots, as many cast ballots as in 2008 when it was done on a decentralized level. So that was good. It was hell on my staff. There's only 8 people in the office. So the 46th day before is craziness as we're trying to make sure every ballot gets out. And I think it's the late requesting. It was mentioned earlier. People are still, even though we have our site up 3 months before to electronically request the ballot, and UOCAVA voters can do it anytime. I mean, the 4 days before the 46th day, we were inundated with FPCAs, and then the people that are requesting it up until a week before that want it by mail still and don't want to do it electronically.
Well, I've been told to open it up to questions actually from the audience. So are y'all game?
And real quick, we had 4% of our UOCAVA votes returned by fax, which was really shocking to me. We just had a change in state law to allow the email return, and 19% of our UOCAVA returns were via email.
If I could just one more thing, there was a discussion earlier about a method to actually have some physical presence or some degree of security with these overseas voters when they're casting. It actually has been done. 2008, there was the distance balloting project that Pat Hollern, who I mentioned earlier from Okaloosa County, did it successfully. So it has been done, and there is a proven model out there for it. So, I'm a big believer in that we still need to be pushing forward on the technology front. Again, it's always balancing accessibility with security.
Sure.
But we have a whole generation. I've got a 9 and 12-year-old boys who have never looked at a phone book in their lives, and they're think the term is natives as it relates to technology. And that's what they know, and that's their base of knowledge and how they communicate moving forward. So if we're going to engage that generation, and even a generation ahead of them, we've got to crack the code. We've got to figure it out.
Okay.
This is Eric Marshall with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. My question's for Gary. One thing that I didn't see on your report in terms of the cause of the provisional ballots was anything related to registration. My understanding was that on Election Day there was some talk about problems particularly with the electronic poll books, that led to a large number of people showing up, believing they're probably registered and were probably registered but weren't showing up at the polling place and casting provisional ballots. Was that something else that you saw in your research about the registration causes for the increase in provisional balloting?
Well, I think there's a little bit of a misunderstanding on how that was. There was not a problem with the electronic poll books per se as far as their functionality. The problem was with getting all of the registrations which were still being processed into the electronic poll books prior to those being released to the precincts. So what you end up with in those situations, you end up with what's called a supplemental list, which is a paper list. And what happened in the county, there were, instead of a few hundred of these, there were thousands of people who were on the supplemental list. The supplemental list was not issued in the same format. Generally what they had was when you opened up your electronic poll book, there was a sheet in there with a supplemental list on it. It may be, maybe none, it may be 10 or something like that. What occurred is the process changed for the issuance of the supplemental list because the registrar was so late in the entering of the information. They were still entering registrations on Saturday and Sunday prior to the election. So they ended up with a process where there were, in some cases, especially where the universities and things like that were located, with hundreds of people on the registration list. So you had it, then it was given to the poll managers in a different format. It was handed to them in an envelope. So we have 359 precincts in our county. You can imagine 359 poll managers receiving something differently. So a lot of that was, I won't say it was poor error, but it was process change which impacted it. And that's a major part of one of the things that we're looking at improving as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, right.
I was wondering if you guys could talk about how you guys communicate with the state. I was wondering if you could talk about the way the state level election officials communicate with local election officials. Something we encountered at the State Department was there were local election officials incorrectly imposing unnecessary requirements on overseas voters, and they were persistently rejecting valid FPCAs. And so in the minority of the cases that were actually brought to our attention, we had to go back and forth with FVAP and FVAP with state election officials and state election officials with local election officials. And so I was just wondering how you make sure that all of these local election officials are appropriately educated.
Yeah, Maggie and I talked about that, so Maggie, go ahead.
Well, as a local election official, we had a unique scenario in 2012 in New Mexico in that as a result of ballots going out late from a handful of counties to the UOCAVA voters in 2010, the entire state was put under a consent decree by the Department of Justice, and the Secretary of State was effectively the entity that was put under the consent decree. However, unlike in Maine, we are responsible, of course, at the county level to get those overseas and military ballots out by the 45-day deadline. And so what the scenario that was created was one by where the Secretary of State was the one under the consent decree, and she was the one responsible for submitting the reports and basically making sure that the counties were compliant. But to be perfectly honest, we weren't getting support from the Secretary of State at the county level. We were basically, make sure you get your report in. Oh, there's an issue with the report. We're going to have to, look at this sort of thing. And so, not specifically to your point, I think in New Mexico, as county clerks, we're all fairly clear about the process. The Secretary of State did give us, we have sort of a obligatory statutory election school that's conducted by the Secretary of State's office prior to each primary and general election. And so we did get some information communicated down to us. But generally speaking, we don't get a lot of great communication or great support from the Secretary of State's office in this particular area. And what we did get was sort of the screws put to us to make sure that we were, meeting deadlines and things like that. I do actually find having that Department of Justice oversight helpful because it really helps us with our accountability processes to make sure that we are meeting the deadline. To the extent that we are having any issues, we are remediating those issues, immediately. When you saw the data earlier talking about some people getting a paper ballot and an email ballot, probably a great handful of those came from Bernalillo County, because if for some reason an issue occurred and a paper ballot was missed or had any problems, then we were also sending out an email ballot. We can do that electronic transmission as well in New Mexico. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that's from the local election official perspective about the communication.